The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to Episode 6 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. Now, I hope you'd be liking pirates, because in this episode, we'll be talking about the golden age of Atlantic piracy with Gregory N. Fleming, author of At the Point of a Cutlass, The Pirate Capture, Bold Escape, and Lonely Exile of Philip Ashton. Okay, so I know I joked around a bit with a bit of pirate speak, but today's conversation with Greg is a serious one. Greg will help us understand how pirate crews lived and worked, what types of ships and cargoes pirates sought to capture, and how they captured them, and details about the dangers pirates and sailors faced on the high Atlantic seas. Oh, and there is one added bonus. Greg will also reveal whether pirates really buried any treasure. But before we get to our interview, I have a modern-day discovery to share with you.
After studying all the best available news, foreign and domestic, Liz has a modern-day discovery to share with you.
Have you ever wanted to try your hand at doing the work of an historian? The Smithsonian Institution is looking for volunteers to help them transcribe and add detail tags to digitized documents from their archives. Transcribing involves reading a handwritten document and creating an exact typed copy of what the handwriting says. Now, what transcribing does is it helps people who cannot read a handwritten script learn what the document says. And tagging works in conjunction with typed transcription to help the internet search engines like Google Search understand what information is in the handwritten document. So, for example, if Google Search knows that a diary entry contains a keyword such as 1777, Saratoga, John Burgoyne, and Horatio Gates, then Google will likely bring the diary entry to the attention of someone searching for the Battle of Saratoga because it knows that the information in that diary entry relates to the battle. Now, personally, I find transcribing to be a lot of fun. Sometimes the fun takes the form of a puzzle, because some people write so horribly that you have to spend time figuring out how to decipher their handwriting. You really need to learn how they write their A's, B's, and C's. And my preferred method for doing this is to compare like letters and like words. Other times, the fun takes the form of discovery. Once you crack the code, once you figure out how a writer writes their letters, the document will reveal what that person thought, said, or did. Now, you don't have to move to Washington, D.C. to participate in this volunteer project. You can do this work right from the comfort of your own home. If you're interested in this kind of work, you can go visit transcription.si.edu which will take you to the Smithsonian Transcription Center, which will provide you all the information you need to participate. And of course, I'll include a link to that Transcription Center in the show notes page for this show. Okay, now without any further ado, here's our conversation with Gregory N. Fleming.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Today we welcome Gregory N. Fleming, a writer living in New England who is the author of the new book, At the Point of a Cutlass, The Pirate Capture, Bold Escape, and Lonely Exile of Philip Ashton. Greg is a graduate of the University of New Hampshire, a former journalist, and he holds a Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. At the Point of a Cutlass is currently in its 8th week on the Boston Globe bestseller list for nonfiction. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Thanks for having me, Liz. It's great to be here.
Today we're going to discuss your latest book, At the Point of a Cutlass, a daring story about pirates, fishermen, and life on the high Atlantic seas during the early to mid part of the 18th century. And personally, I was very excited to read your book because, a little known fact about me, for about a year or two as a little kid, what I wanted to be when I grew up was a pirate. So your book was enlightening on what my life would have been like, and it wasn't anything like I had imagined. But before we jump into pirates and fishermen, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a native New Englander. I grew up in New England and have lived most of my life in New England. I currently live just outside of Boston. I did short stints, as you mentioned, in Madison, Wisconsin for graduate school and also in Washington, D.C. I've had a lifelong love of history and exploration in the sea. And I was just thrilled to discover Philip Ashton's story that we'll talk about today because it combines all three and really just provided a wonderful topic for a book.
That's interesting, and I'm intrigued by how you came to the story of Philip Ashton because, as you mentioned in your book, there are no statues to Ashton nor memorials in his hometown. So how did you find him, and why did you decide to research and write about his life?
So I came across the story almost by accident. I was reading another great maritime history about the pirate Henry Morgan by Stephen Talty. And about a third of the way through the book, I came across a single quotation from a young man talking about how awful, just how terrible it was to live aboard a pirate ship. And this young man was a captive aboard the pirate ship. And I stopped right then and there, and I said, wait a minute, there's a narrative, a written record that exists from someone who had been a captive aboard a pirate ship, and I started to look into this story, and I quickly found out that, in fact, there was a man named Philip Ashton. He was a real person from Marblehead, Massachusetts, and he had, in fact, been captured by one of the worst pirates of the 18th century and sailed with them for 9 months. And then, remarkably, he escaped and lived alone as a castaway on an uninhabited island in the Caribbean for another 2 years. All of that struck me as an incredible story and one that needed to be told.
Wow. So how bad was life aboard a pirate ship? I mean, Johnny Depp makes it look like a lot of fun in his Pirates of the Caribbean movies.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty bad, and it was particularly bad for young men like Philip Ashton who were captives, and there were many young men who were taken captive during this era. One of the real surprises that comes out from my research is that how important captives were to a working pirate ship. We have, as you say, from movies like Pirates of the Caribbean, we have images of pirate ships as jolly, raucous places, but the fact is that pirate ships weren't just made up of pirates; they were made up of captives, young men who were taken and forced aboard, and they frequently comprised, 1/4, even 1/3, or more of a vessel. And so for young guys like Philip Ashton and others, they were forced to cook and clean, to man the sails, to stand cold nighttime watches, to help carry heavy equipment, cannon and guns and chests from captured ships over to the pirate ship, all the while being treated as a prisoner or servant, with none of the rewards such as there were of being a pirate.
So captives like Ashton wouldn't have received any booty from the ships they captured?
None whatsoever, but that in part was Ashton's choice. When they brought young men aboard, they tried to get them to join the crew. That was the first question they asked. Will you join the crew? Will you sign the ship's articles and become a member of the pirate? And by doing so, you would be entitled to a share of any spoils that the pirates gained. But Ashton intentionally refused. He never succumbed to either their temptations or their threats, and was never a member of the pirate crew.
Why did Ashton resist becoming a pirate, and why did others decide to turn pirate?
So that's a really one of the really fascinating threads in my book, and as we discover how important and how prevalent captives were aboard a pirate ship. Ashton refused with good reason, because if a pirate ship was captured, and many of Edward Lowe's men were captured, they were presumed, just by the simple presence of being on board, to be pirates, and many of these men were executed, hanged. In fact, one of the other Marblehead fishermen who was captured on the same night as Philip Ashton, his friend Joseph Libby, happened to be aboard one of Edward Lowe's sloops when it was captured off of Newport, Rhode Island, and brought back to Newport and put on trial. And even though he professed that he was innocent and was a forced man, and showed proof of that, the court found him guilty. And Joseph Libby and 25 other men were executed in Newport, Rhode Island in 1723. It was one of the largest mass executions in the history of America. So Ashton knew that what would happen if he was a signed member of the pirate crew, and refused, and many other young men did as well, despite being, beaten and whipped for that. Other men did join because they figured, I'm aboard. I would rather be a part of the crew and get better treatment and potentially get a share of any riches, and take my chances. And so some men did make that choice. And that's how the pirates got many of their recruits.
So it wasn't just a financial choice. I mean, this was a choice that potentially had grave complications if you were to get caught.
Very grave, very grave. And the young men were aware of this. There's one incident I talk about in my book of another captive who actually, in a gunfight, got his leg shot up, and they had to cut off his leg. Amputate his leg, and so they offered to send him home to shore with a fishing vessel, and he refused. He said, "Nope. If I go ashore, they'll think I'm a pirate, and they'll hang me just because I've been aboard." So men were very, very scared of the potential accusation of being a pirate and the inability to defend themselves.
So I'd like to discuss, who captured the pirates and how they were captured. But I guess maybe even before we discuss that, how did pirate ships operate? Was there a pirate code, and how did they go about capturing other vessels?
So there was a pirate code. It was typically, these were referred to as the ship's articles. And the articles were a list of rules or codes by which the crew agreed and lived by. So for example, they specified how many shares of any treasure or riches each man would get. The captain would get, more. The quartermaster would get slightly less, and regular, ordinary crewmen would get even a smaller share. But it was specified out the shares that you would get. It also had rules just about everyday life. No firing of weapons below decks in the hold. The man who first spots a potential ship to capture would get choice of the first pistol off of that ship if it was captured. And by signing, when men came aboard, they were invited to sign the ship's articles, sign their name to it, and that would indicate that they were a member of the crew and had signed on. And so each of the pirate ships during this era had those. Edward Lowe's articles exist to this day. We have a record of them. And that's what Philip Ashton refused to sign, but what many other men did sign.
And how did they decide which vessels to capture? Were they looking for a specific kind of boat or a specific kind of cargo when they went after a vessel?
So that's another striking thing that kind of runs counter to conventional wisdom or popular images. Obviously, pirates were looking for money and gold and valuables, and if they saw a vessel that they believed had a lot of that, they would certainly go after it. But you have to remember, during this era, most of the vessels that were crisscrossing the Atlantic and the Caribbean were carrying very ordinary trading goods, lumber, salted fish, grain, molasses and rum and sugar from the Caribbean. And so most of the time, that's what the pirates would capture when they captured a vessel. The pirates during this era, and certainly Edward Lowe's crew, would go after just about any ship from any nation that they saw. And the reason was because they wanted to see what they could find aboard in terms of valuables. They constantly needed food and water. They couldn't go ashore and buy or trade for food and water because they were operating illegally. So they had to get all the food and water that they needed to support a very large crew by capturing other ships and taking it off of them, and they did that all the time. They were also looking for new recruits, other young men that they could take aboard and force aboard and try and entice to join their crew. So most of the captures, and there were many during the period that Edward Lowe and a few other pirates were sailing in the early 1720s, the newspapers had reports of captures every week or two. I mean, it was a very big presence, and they were mostly capturing brigantines and sloops and schooners that were running the traditional trading routes across the Atlantic and down through the Caribbean.
So who would have thought? I mean, instead of gold, it sounds like what the pirates were really after, first and foremost, was food and water. But what would have happened if they captured a lumber vessel? How would they have disposed of the lumber or made money off it? Or would they have attempted to make money off the lumber?
They typically didn't. They typically would take everything they wanted off of the vessel, and then they would just, including some men if they wanted to force any men, and then they would either let the vessel go on its way with the remaining member of the crew, or if they wanted the vessel, they would take the vessel too and burn the contents or dump them overboard. So in Philip Ashton's narrative, he talks several times about, a Portuguese a vessel that was captured off of the Azores. It was full of grain going back to Europe. They took the vessel they wanted. It was a nice big vessel, and they just dumped, cask by cask, all the grain overboard. Other times they would get ships full of lumber, and they would just burn the ships and burn the lumber. They didn't really care about the property. They would take what they wanted and then either let the ship go or destroy it.
And in some cases, they would take the ship as their own, right? And then that would be the pirate ship.
Yeah, very often. They like to have fleets of two or more vessels. Lowe at some point had as many as 3 vessels, and so they would often take another vessel if it was seaworthy, split their crew up and sail, together, which made it easier, obviously, to capture ships too.
Now, I have to ask, for every kid at heart that's ever dreamed of being a pirate, did pirates really bury treasure? Like, say they came across a ship with gold and jewels on it, would they have taken it to an island and buried it?
So, it's hard to know. Down in the island where Philip Ashton was marooned and lived as the castaway is called Roatan off the coast of Honduras. And many, many pirates went there, not just Edward Lowe and Francis Spriggs, but Blackbeard went there. Henry Morgan went there. So it was a very popular island for a number of reasons among pirates. In the last century, a number of treasure hunters have gone to Roatan and looked for treasure, and there are some stories that I talk about in my book of treasure hunters apparently finding treasure. Some people on the island say that these stories are fictional. Others claim they're true, but it's quite interesting. The other thing that's interesting about Edward Lowe is I talked earlier about the brutal capture of one of his vessels and the execution of the men in Newport, Rhode Island. Well, after that, Edward Lowe got away, and he sailed north up to the coast of Nova Scotia, and we know that. And about around 1950, a Massachusetts historian named Edward Rowe Snow acquired a map that he believes was a treasure map from Edward Lowe, the pirate. And it indicated that at a small island in the Bay of Fundy, just off Nova Scotia, there was treasure. And this historian, Edward Rowe Snow, went up there and dug around for a couple days, and did in fact find Portuguese gold coins buried in the sand that seemed to match perfectly in terms of the time period when Edward Lowe might have been sailing. This was a pretty spectacular find. It was written up in Life magazine when he returned with his treasure, and I have a copy of this treasure map, and I talk about the story in my book. So it's quite possible that he did, in fact, discover buried treasure from Edward Lowe.
Did you try to use the map to, find the X where X marks the spot, Greg?
I personally have not gone up there, and I'm sure since the story was pretty highly publicized, many others, and I doubt there's much left, but who knows?
So your book is centered around Philip Ashton and the man who captured him, Edward Lowe. Now, I've heard of Blackbeard, I've heard of Captain Kidd, I've even heard of Henry Morgan. And they're supposed to be the names of the most famous or infamous pirates. But you state that Edward Lowe and his occasional partner, George Lowther, were perhaps two of the worst pirates who ever plied the Atlantic Ocean. Can you tell us a little bit about Edward Lowe and why he was so brutal? I mean, why did Philip Ashton want to escape his presence?
Yeah, so I think without question, Edward Lowe was one of the worst pirates of this period, the early 1700s. He sailed just a few years after Blackbeard. Blackbeard gained notoriety because he was captured in North Carolina. Edward Lowe never was captured. But Edward Lowe and his crew captured more ships and killed more men than any other pirate of the era. And they were particularly known for just their horrific torture of men and particularly sea captains when they captured them, usually to get them to confess where any valuables were held or to get them to comply with the pirates' wishes. So they were known for taking flames like matches and burning the thin piece of skin between your fingers to get people to talk. Lowe was even worse. I mean, he was known for literally cutting the lips or ears off of captured sea captains, sometimes even the heart, while the victim was alive, and roasting the body parts over a fire on the ship's deck. So he was just an awful psychopath. There's no other way to put it. He was just an awful, awful man. And, one British official in the Caribbean said of Lowe at the time, "A greater monster never infested the seas." And I think that's really true.
Okay, I think you've convinced us. Lowe's a really bad guy. So why do so few people know his name today as a brutal pirate?
I think, as I mentioned, it's because Blackbeard was captured and brought to justice. So, for that matter, was Captain Kidd. But Edward Lowe never was. He was almost captured in the brutal battle with the British warship, the HMS Greyhound, off of Newport, Rhode Island. And he half of his crew was captured that day, but Lowe escaped, and nobody knows whatever happened to Edward Lowe. He continued to sail as late as 1725, 1726, and there's no record of his death. I will say that he was so awful that eventually, by around late 1723, early 1724, his own crew voted him out of office. It's important to remember that pirate ships during this period were fairly democratic, and the captain was elected and served at the will of the crew. And he was just so bad that his own crew abandoned him and set him off in another vessel. But nobody knows. There are reports from as late as 1725, 1726 from New England sea captains and from the captains of British warships of Lowe still being down in the Caribbean. So he was never captured, and nobody knows ultimately what happened to him.
I know this is a serious historical story. You know, pirates, they were democratic, and did select their captains. But I can't help but picture in my mind a reality television show called by Survivor, Pirate Ship Edition, with them voting him off the ship. But I know we're talking about a serious matter. So we've talked a lot about pirates, but we haven't talked a lot about the main person in your story, Philip Ashton. How did he get captured by pirates, and how did he escape?
So his capture was off the coast of Nova Scotia. He was a fisherman. At that time, in the early 1700s, salt cod was a huge export out of colonial New England, and Marblehead, Massachusetts, was in fact the salt cod capital of the world. And Philip Ashton and Joseph Libby and a couple other guys, they were young, 18, 19 years old, fishermen from Marblehead, Massachusetts, and they would sail in these wooden schooners about a week's sail up to the coast of Nova Scotia and fish for cod and salt it. And when they had a full ship, they would take it back and back to Marblehead. Well, on a Friday afternoon, Philip Ashton and his crew were heading back into a remote harbor on the east coast of Nova Scotia to anchor for the weekend. And it was there that the pirates were waiting, and they captured a number of vessels that weekend, one of which was Philip Ashton's fishing schooner. And they came aboard, captured Philip Ashton and Joseph Libby, forced them into their boat, took them back to the pirate ship, and kept them for the next 9 months.
Wow! So if they kept him in the pirate ship for 9 months, then he obviously escaped, and you mentioned that he goes to the island of Roatan. How long did it take him to get rescued?
So it took him almost another 2 years. He escaped in March of 1723, 9 months after his capture, and he did not find passage home until the spring of 1725. Wow. He arrived back in Massachusetts for the first time in 25. So 2 years he was living on Roatan, and for more than half of that time, he was completely alone.
We often think of these little Caribbean islands, or you said it was off the coast of Honduras, but we think of these tropical islands as tropical paradises. Who hasn't been stressed out and pictured what it would be like to be on an uninhabited island? What was his experience like?
Well, it's interesting because the area where he landed, or where he escaped, was actually there were palm trees, but it was not, open sandy beaches. It was a very thickly wooded, almost jungle-like environment. In fact, the only reason the pirates went ashore, which allowed him to escape, was they were looking for fresh drinking water, and he went ashore to help, and then just ran off into the thick woods. Philip Ashton has been called America's real-life Robinson Crusoe because, he lived by himself on an island for 2 years. But he actually could have written a book on how not to be a Robinson Crusoe, because he had absolutely no advance notice that he was going to be able to get away, and so he made no preparations whatsoever. He had no knife, no gun, no way to make a fire, and he didn't even have shoes. And so what it meant was he had to literally claw out a living with his bare hands. He would pick and eat, fruit and figs from the trees growing on the island. He would even dig sea turtle eggs out of the sand and eat them raw. And he built simple shelters and just basically foraged the island and spent hours and hours sitting along the shore just waiting for help. And eventually, in time, he does get help, but it was a pretty dismal existence, and his diet was incredibly limited. And because he had no clothing or no fire, he becomes at some points very, very sick, and quite frankly, he probably almost died.
So if somebody were to ask Philip Ashton before, after his experience, what is the one thing you would take with you to a deserted island? What do you think he would have selected?
I'm guessing he would have said a way to make a fire, a flint or something, because not having a fire and not being able to cook food for much of his time there was probably one of the hardest things he had. I mean, I guess the second choice or a close first would be a knife, because that would have allowed him to do things like, capture and cut up food, break open, thick, tough coconuts and things like that. But I know that the lack of a fire, particularly when the winter rainy season comes into the island, and he's wet and cold all the time, that was a real hardship for him.
I guess we can all stand to learn something from the tale of Philip Ashton. I will now be prepared to answer that question about what I would take to an island when it comes up again. But I do want to be respectful of your time, and we've had a very interesting conversation, and I wish we had a bit more time. But as we're almost finished, it is time for our fun segment, which is called the Time Warp.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. So here's your question. In your opinion, what might have happened if Philip Ashton had turned pirate?
That's a very interesting question. I actually speculate about that very question a little bit in my book, towards the end of the book, because I'm talking about, obviously, the difference between Philip Ashton and Joseph Libby, his crewmate and friend who was captured. Chances are, one of two things could have happened. Philip Ashton could have turned pirate. He would have had a better existence aboard Lowe's pirate ship. He wouldn't have been beaten and whipped and treated so badly. And he might have survived as long as Lowe and his quartermasters did, and continued to sail through the Caribbean, maybe even have made some good captures at some point and gotten some riches, and eventually, found his way ashore to an inhabited Caribbean island or someplace in the New England colonies and lived out his life. The downside, though, is he could have been, like his friend Joseph Libby, aboard the sloop that was captured and brought back to Newport, Rhode Island. And just like Joseph Libby and many other young men from both the American colonies and London, he could have been charged with being a pirate, accused of being a pirate, despite his protests that he was innocent. And he, too, could have been executed in Newport, Rhode Island, which would have been a tragic and very early death.
So say he had turned pirate and he had made his way to a populated Caribbean island and just left the ship. Would he still be subject to punishment for having turned pirate in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were many, I talk about the Newport execution, but there were many other executions of pirates in the Caribbean as well, including on Jamaica and other islands. So yeah, if there was any evidence or any British official got wind of, or French official for that matter, got wind of the fact that he was part of Edward Lowe's crew, he would have been certainly prosecuted and potentially killed. So he would have had to, fade into society, taking work, doing something else, and obviously tried to cover up his tracks as best he could have.
Well, Greg, I thank you for the life lessons in pirates. I no longer think a pirate's life is for me, so I'm glad I became a historian, so thank you for that. Before we conclude, what historical person or event are you researching and writing about now?
So I haven't settled on specifically on my next topic. I continue to read and research. Obviously, I as I mentioned at the outset, I'm fascinated by the history of exploration, and so those are the areas that I continue to read about and think about, and hopefully a new topic will come my way very soon. So
you're going to leave us in suspense, but I guess you're in suspense too. But so where's the best place to find out more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you? And I guess in the future, what your next research project will be.
Sure. So the best place is just to go to my my website, gregfleming.com, 2 M's in Fleming. And there's photos from my trip to Roatan, where Philip Ashton was marooned, and other images from my research and images of Edward Lowe, the pirate. And then there's, in addition to my occasional blog posts, there's my events calendar and a way to contact me, and would love to hear from anyone who has questions or thoughts or other perspectives.
Are you on Twitter or Facebook?
Yep, I am on Twitter, and there's links to both Twitter and Facebook on my website.
And we'll be I'll be sure to include those links on the show notes page of this episode as well. Well, Greg, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you, Liz. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
I, for one, am grateful we had the opportunity to talk to Greg today. I mean, he reassured me that I made the right career choice. Being an historian is a safer and more secure line of work than being a pirate. But in all seriousness, I really did learn a lot from Greg. I mean, who knew that captives made up anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of the sailors aboard a pirate ship? I really did think that everyone on board a pirate ship had to be a pirate. I also had no idea that pirates really wanted ships with food on board. I mean, I guess they wanted money and jewels, but when it comes down to it, you can't survive on eating gold pieces and jewels. You can find information about Greg, his book, At the Point of a Cutlass, plus everything we talked about today, on the show notes page for this episode, which you will find at benfranklinsworld.com/006. If you enjoyed today's episode, please tell your friends about us. Although we won't be on iTunes until December, I am pleased to announce that we are now on Stitcher Radio. You can subscribe by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/Stitcher. Now, if you do subscribe via Stitcher, I would be grateful if you would leave us a rating and a review. Positive ratings and reviews will help bring Ben Franklin's World to the attention of other history lovers who may not yet be aware of our show. I know that leaving a review takes a bit of time, so if you do leave a 5-star rating and review, I will be sure to mention your name on an upcoming show as my small way of saying thank you. Now, if you don't think this show deserves a 5-star rating, I hope you'll let me know. I would love to know what I can do to improve both the format of the show and my skills as a podcaster. I really want Ben Franklin's World to be the best podcast it can be, so you will keep tuning in and enjoying history with me. Now, finally, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about the show, history, or future guests, please send me an email. My email address is liz@benfranklinsworld.com, or you can send me a tweet. My Twitter handle is @LizCovart.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.